Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Our topic is racial slurs, and we have three professors from the Department of Ethnic Studies to discuss this topic. It's a timely one, and so we have Pensri, Elisa White, and John Okamura. Thank you all for coming, and we all teach at Ethnic Studies, including me. Yeah. So I figure that, of late there have been a number of personalities, especially media personalities, who have uttered certain racial slurs. For instance, the last of them was the most recent, that is Doug Chapman, using the N-word in a long conversation with his son over the phone, by the way. And that came out like about 8 months after the fact. And then previous to that, Imus, who had this show, Imus in the Morning. So when he uttered those kinds of slurs against the sports team, he went from Imus in the Morning to what I like to call Imus in Morning, because he lost all his support and financial support and all that kind of stuff. And then locally, Larry Price talking about Howleys, and insulting one senator from Kauai, and he told him to go back to his wherever he came from. But this senator has been here like for 37 years, 38 years, and so on. So anyway, we would like to discuss those kinds of issues. And to begin with, perhaps, is like we start with you, Pensri, if you would. What is your take from, as an academic and as a person living in this society? What's your take on these racial slurs and how you look at them, and whether you also deal with them in your, classes or one of your classes? So
Sure.
if we could talk about that.
My position on racial slurs is that there are certain realms in which it may be appropriate, generally in terms of comedy, certain types of comedy, when it's dealing with satire or parody. For example, people like Mencia, or on other sort of comedians who do it well in a way to get the audience to think more critically about why are these racial slurs being used and what exactly is being said and who is the speaker. And so it's really self-reflexive as opposed to simply insulting someone for the sake of insulting someone to hurt someone's feelings. In that sense, I think it's appropriate to talk about racial slurs in that context. I also feel it's appropriate to talk about racial slurs when in an educational context, whether it be in our classes or even among peers, just having a conversation to talk about why are certain racial slurs inappropriate and why and when can they be appropriate, as long as there's dialogue and it's not simply being used as a way to be hurtful or malicious. So that's
So what you are saying basically is that to educate the public and ourselves about what it means, given the history of race in the United States as a whole, then it would be appropriate so that people can be elevated to a higher level of consciousness about history and about the other, whoever the other might be.
right.
Elisa, what is your take on that?
Well, I definitely agree with Pensri, especially in the context of comedy, but I think even as we have this topic about racial slurs tonight, we have to make a very critical distinction here, and that is that there are different types of pop cultural expressions of racism that we see all of the time. But we need to distinguish between those types of expressions of racism and more, shall we say, substantive expressions of racism that have translations in terms of political inequalities, social inequalities, justice inequalities, and so forth. So I think that's really clear, because every time someone says the N-word, and I'll throw it on the table there as the N-word here, my children are watching tonight, we have to understand that it's not necessarily the kind of act that's going to necessarily lead to inequalities in education or discrimination in housing directly, or discrimination in terms of employment employment. But we, of course, have to look at these racial slurs as an extension of that, or in the context of comedy, maybe presenting some transgressive discussion of it. And even in comedy, we have to think, well, if everyone's not in on the joke, it can be slightly problematic. But definitely, I think we have to make those critical distinctions, which is why when I think of the dog and the N-word, you know, a chuckle comes to me, not in the sense that I think it's particularly funny, but I'm just always amazed that it seems so shocking to people that someone like Mr. Dwayne Dog Chapman would utter the N-word. I mean, I haven't seen his curriculum of the Thai, but I'm sure if I did see his CV, we would not necessarily think worldly or enlightened, and we would not be surprised that he uses the N-word. So I think we have to think about these types of things and put them in a particular context. Even when we get excited about them, we have to look at what the real political translation is.
Yes, so you're making like a distinction here between institutionalized, you know, ethnic slurs, or in terms of racism, etc., and those that, you know, you just say them because part of your vernacular. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I should say that, I mean, the ones that are in the vernacular are coming from a particularly historically situated moment. And we don't have to, you know our U.S. history to know that at least on the most basic level, the N-word has been problematic for centuries here. And there are many reasons we can tease them out, hopefully, in this discussion as to why it reappears in various contexts. I think it's important to think about. But I also think that when we're looking at the fact that, you know, African Americans are disproportionately represented in the military, going off to Iraq, I mean, that's an issue. Whether Dog Chapman says the N-word is not really something that we need to fight for a change to. I mean, I don't care what A&E does, quite frankly. Whether they keep him on or not is not the issue. We have larger fish to fry, to use a cliche.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, it's very important, that kind of distinction, and then I like to follow it up later on in the discussion. But John, what do you think?
Well, I agree with what Elisa has just said. It's just a manifestation of the racism in Hawaii and the U.S. in general. And we've come to tolerate the use of these terms, and that's why this seems to be such a major issue at this point. And I would also agree with what she said, whether or not the show gets canceled, the problem still is racism. And how to eliminate that, that's a much larger issue that has to be addressed. Well, what bothers me with the kind of individuals that you mentioned about how they get around that racism is the quick fix. You know, I'm going to meet with my spiritual advisor. I'm going to, I'm apologizing to the community that I offended. I promise I'll never say the word again, as though that's going to solve the problem. The problem, much larger problem, is one of racism. Right. And we can't pretend that as long as people make these kinds of promises, racism is going to go away. Whether or not people use the N-word or not, racism persists.
Yeah. In fact, I saw a decal, you know, put on the car, says abolish racism. So I smiled, because how can you abolish racism like that, you know, just like that? You have to really work hard at it, and especially institutional racism. That's the one that you have to really target and wipe it out. But the other thing, it seems to me, there is an interplay between somebody like Imus in the morning, or like someone, TV personality or not, public figure, talking about you know, race and being racist and using racial slurs, and reinforcement of that in the institutions, or reinforcing the institutions through that. So there is like this kind of dialectic between the two arenas, or two spaces where these things are uttered, even though at times you know, like somebody like Dog Chapman, he's not gonna be saying, well, you can't go to school because you're black. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I mean, this is clear. But still, I think there is that kind of interaction, or you know, dialectic between the two spaces where these things are happening, whether it is institutional racism on the one hand, and the socialization process that creates people who might be filling certain institutions in society, who would then be discriminating against others. I mean, so I'm thinking along those lines. So what do you think about this, or something else as regards that matter?
Well, these institutional racist reactions are usually done by individuals who are much more covert in their antagonism. And so the fact that we have these few high-profile media personalities saying these very things is sort of interesting from a societal standpoint, because people kind of latch on to those overt expressions of racism, when in fact it's really the subtle stuff, that the reasons how people work behind the scenes to make it difficult for certain minority groups or any other group to move into the institutions, to sort of break the glass ceiling, if you will. And so I actually agree really with what Elisa is saying, is that, the real issue is racism, and it's not about what people blurt, but rather what they do, and the implication of what their actions are, and they are not reflective. They don't really think about, oh, okay, well, what am I going to do to make change? Not in terms of how I'm presenting myself, as John said. Yes, I will go and talk to my personal advisor. I will apologize to the community. That's not going to do anything, because it's just a way of deflecting your own responsibility to try to do something more creative. For example, he could have simply gone to the woman, I think it was her son's girlfriend,
yeah.
gone apologize to her and say, welcome to the family.
Yeah.
That speaks much more volumes, because it started because of this.
Yes.
Right?
Not that she'd want to join the family after all that,
True.
but it would
Right.
be her choice.
Right? It's like, and what can I do to sort of make up for this? The fact that I've alienated you personally, and your family from our family.
It's interesting. Go
But
ahead.
the thing that's also kind of under the table here as we think about this is the fact that part of his argument is that, well, he uses the N-word because he feels some kind of simpatico, he doesn't phrase it that way, with the quote-unquote black community. And of course that's problematic, but we talk about that, and we probably will talk about it in the context of hip-hop and who uses the N-word and who owns it. But if anything, Chapman just joins the line of individuals racialized as white who decide that they somehow can identify with some element of the black community that chooses to use the N-word. And overwhelmingly, African Americans don't particularly love using the N-word. And so here you have a class distinction being made, even as he feels he connects with certain blacks. He sees them as all blacks, of course, which is part of the racism. That's a part of his own argument, I think. But the other part of it too is that he's not new on the scene. I mean, gosh, Norman Mailer died last weekend. Okay, and in his obits, you read them, and of course they go through the process. A grand writer who was, of course, very pugnacious and a sexist, as we know. But the other part of it is that in 1957 he writes the white Negro. Okay, not the N-word, but the white Negro. Negro was comfortable at the time. It was as acceptable as African American is today, as far as language, identity language. But he uses that because he, as a white man, felt he identified with the outsider status of the quote-unquote Negro. Now James Baldwin later calls him on this and says, no, he wasn't really in with the blacks, but he wanted to be, But he felt, because he was a beatnik, he felt part of the outside. And you see this all the time. So Dog, feels he's somehow part of the subculture that identifies with black experience. And I mean, what's the classic, John, you love your music, your rock and roll music, you rocks, yes, the Beatles, those rock fans. But if you think, I was listening to my iPod, this is not a plug for those folks at the Apple store, but I was listening to my iPod this morning, and spinning through it came up Patti Smith's rock and roll N-word. She uses the 6-letter word in that. And her 1978 song has this idea, she says the lyrics are, Jimi Hendrix was an N-word. Jesus Christ and Grandma too. Jackson Pollock was an N-word. N-word, 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 N-word. And she says, outside of society, they're waiting for me outside of society, that's where I want to be. So here she was in 1978 kind of appropriating this idea that you could be an N-word because you're somehow a rebel. So we see that happening over and over again in the hip-hop context too, and I think that has to be considered. It's problematic when you essentialize it and say it's all black experience, but still it has to be teased out if we're thinking about these slurs.
Yeah, because as you said, most blacks don't use that word, and they don't like hip-hop artists or others to use it, so which is the black experience, this, that, or some other experience, so it is very important,
Well, I guess there was the John Lennon song, Woman is the N-word of the World, and it came out in the 70s. I would put this in the context of other ethnic slurs used in Hawaii too, though, by comedians, in terms of the references to Filipinos as dog eaters, for example. And that's become, because of I guess the widespread use of ethnic humor in Hawaii and the way that jokes get repeated, there's been this acceptance of ethnic humor as something acceptable that one can repeat in public spaces without questioning it. And that's the problem I see with this, if people continue to use words like the N-word, we don't make a distinction. Also with the term haole, then that gets represented as derogatory. And without questioning the origins of the term itself and the fact that it's one of the terms that survived the abolition of the Hawaiian language to common use, even by non-Hawaiians. But I've seen references now to people questioning, well, how come we can say haole in public? Of course, they omit the beginning adjective that makes it a really demeaning term.
But also, you know, you can use haole in a certain way.
Sure, you just did, didn't you?
Absolutely. But then, you know, in another way, depending upon the intonation and how you use it, etc., it becomes a racial slur as well, or something derogatory, right? I mean,
with an appropriate adjective.
Right. Yeah. So that's, I think it's important to like really distinguish between those kinds of things and not like just put a blanket statement in terms of Hawaii usage of certain terms. Like another thing, like from the Pacific, for instance, and here like kanaka, you know, kanaka, that's meaning like, you know, derogatory against Hawaiians. But in New Caledonia, for instance, which is the indigenous population call it Kanaki, you know, they appropriated the word and created a different kind of understanding or meaning for it. And now they use it with pride, you see, so they did that kind of thing. So agency is, I think, is very important in terms of trying to move words and change them. Even like the N-word, you know, like Martin Luther King would use it at one point, and not only him, but everybody else. And it was okay at that time to be used even by blacks. And now it's different. So,
with King, I think maybe those were unearthed in an FBI tape, and we can get into COINTELPRO and the great work they did. But you know. No,
he would use it like when he would like give a talk and so on. So could you give us some historic background about how the change occurred from from using it to not using it, and it becoming derogatory to the point that we had to invent or create different words like African American or black and stuff?
Well, I mean, the N-word has a long history, and of course Randall Kennedy wrote a book on it, exploring that history. It was rather controversial in itself. But there hasn't necessarily been a time when you can say that some African Americans perhaps stopped using the N-word in their casual conversations, whereas there hasn't been a time where certain African Americans decided collectively that they would start, you know. So, I mean, it's such a diverse population. But I mean, the N-word itself, of course, has been a signature of power, you know. It's a way of signing, you have no power. And using that, we know historically that has been the case, but at the same time, in the context of, say, slavery and even during the Jim Crow era, individuals of African descent have certainly been able to use those words to empower themselves and to show some ownership of the word to maybe erase its sting. But has that happened? No, because we wouldn't be having this conversation in the 21st century if the sting were somehow, you know, gone. But I think to think of it in terms of, what has happened with African Americans? Do they use it now? Did they stop? Why did King use it at one time, or other individuals? King, in his major speeches, you would never have seen him using the N-word or heard him using the N-word. And so I would have to look at the documentation that you have regarding the times when he had used the N-word. But in particular,
I've heard him use it,
in particular, you can look at it in the case of the South. In the South, representing certain groups, representing a community, sometimes the idea of the N-word applying to an individual who is considered lowly or lazy, or even the context of African American society. People would say, well, he's not really acceptable in our community, so he's an N-word. But at other times, it's almost like dude, or, can be used in the surfer scene, or other types of ways of describing people that have been embraced as positive. So I think all of the usages of the N-word have been coterminous, and we just have to tease out the context and which population and who decides they own it. So it's, that's part
We
of it.
have a caller, Sandra from Wailua. So you're on the air, Sandra.
Hi, I'm just calling because I just had a comment on the N-word and the H-word, haole. But as far as the N-word, I mean, I agree with Elisa about the fact that, understanding really sort of why people are using it. There's more to it. People that tend to use it in a negative way. It's all about basically that. To me, it's about racism. I don't agree that it should be used at all personally. I think it shouldn't be used by anyone, even the black community. And I'm actually, I might sound like I'm white myself, but my dad's from the Caribbean, my mom's English, or haole. The point is, though, is that it's like any word. I mean, you can use the word, people use the word haole here in Hawaii, and it's not necessarily in a derogative way. Sometimes it's just a way of expression. If you're talking to, I could be describing my own mother or my boyfriend, and I might say that in the sense that, just describing him, because if I'm talking to someone that's local, I know that they'll know what I mean. But I think any word that you use, if you use it in a negative way, a way to put somebody down, it's always, it's never a good time to do it. And I think the problem is, it's true that you really need to look at why they're saying that. I mean, they're saying it because obviously they have issues with a particular race, most of the time, and just in growing up, I'm actually from England, and it's probably, you can tell that by my accent, but, I've actually, I think once I was called the N-word when I was a young girl once, but I was called other things too, I think, that, weren't even part of my race, but it's just somebody picking on someone for whatever reason. And I think, I just want to make a point about Dov Chapman quickly, is that,
go ahead.
He, I do find it a little bit laughable because, the point is he went ahead and used that in such a fierce way. I think he really used that in a really fierce way. And I didn't even get the impression at all that he was trying to use it in a sort of camaraderie way with, with the black community. The point is, the fact that he said he wouldn't want his daughter to date one. And I always remember that my dad always said to me, there's always a way that you can tell, and I think I remember even thinking this when I was 16, that you can tell if somebody really is racist because if they have a problem with a daughter or son dating or marrying your child, then, and this is what happened with him. He may have not even realized he had a problem with racism, and that many people probably don't.
Okay.
And then it comes to the crunch when your own family is involved with somebody of a different race that you really didn't even maybe realize that you had a problem with, and suddenly it is a problem, and obviously he just couldn't, hold back, and maybe, possibly, this may have opened up many people's eyes here in Hawaii or here all over the U.S., or I don't know if he's even on TV in other countries, but the point is, it may make people think to themselves, well, would I have a problem with that? I might not use that word, but would I have a problem with that?
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you very much.
Okay.
We have another caller
Can
from...
we just comment on what the last caller said?
Yeah,
as
but
well?
let me do that maybe like we can. Since Mr. Youngquist is from Liliha, he's on the line. You're on the line. Thanks. Go ahead.
Good evening. This is Arvid. I met one of you the other day at the Peace and Justice Center. And I've always
I remember your name.
Many of the people who have appeared in the protests in Hawaii, and you being one of them. Regards to the racial slur usage of the word Nigger, I think it was unfortunate, and it should never have occurred, particularly in the private home of the Doug Chapman family, in the relationship between his son and his girlfriend, fiancée. I come from Japan. I'm a Hawaiʻi U.S. citizen born and raised in Japan, where when they say Yankee go home, it applies to any American. Doesn't matter what race they belong to. My father, who's deceased, was a Nixon Republican. He taught me never to use the N-word, and that doesn't mean the term Negro, which was perfectly acceptable as an Army classification. And later in the years, the Army decided to subscribe to the Black Power movement, and many people who are black, who preferred to be classified as Pacific Islander or Hawaiian, all of a sudden became African American. And it's very important for people to know their ethnic heritage. That's true. But I think sometimes people who are politically correct, sometimes are deeply racist. I consider myself and refer to myself often as a racist. And then I follow that up as a human racist. And people sort of skip a beat and they realize what I'm getting at. You can be totally politically correct and inoffensive to people who you converse with, but permit Portuguese jokes and Polish jokes.
Yeah.
But I'll stop here and continue with your conversation between you two.
So we can integrate those two and then talk about it. You wanted to jump in.
Well, I was just commenting on the previous caller, just thinking about the fact that she had mentioned that definitely the context of Dog's statements were not in the spirit of camaraderie, even as, some of us find that even problematic to use the N-word in those contexts, but certainly they weren't. It was definitely a very vitriolic statement, and definitely it was clear that he was more racist, as it were, than he would really express.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about what Pensri was talking about in terms of the girlfriend, his son's girlfriend. We're talking about Dog. Larry King was asking him, would you have him marry her now? Would you be objecting to your son marrying his girlfriend? He hesitated a bit and then said, well, he'd better marry her now, but his argument was for the wrong reason. Now after she has, all this thing has happened, So already it is a problem here. It's not for the correct reasons or the right reasons that he wants him to marry her. So that tells you how, for instance, when he goes to see his spiritual advisor and what's on, what's happening right here? Is it really mea culpa really coming out of the heart, or it's just a matter of, hey, I don't want to lose my TV show or something?
I think what his major concern is.
The spiritual advisor, isn't that corporate America?
Yeah, and the guy, he is gonna, I forget his name, but he's a corporate guy, and he's a motivating, speaker, motivation or something like that.
Really?
Yeah, so there you go. Yeah, I've seen him on TV a couple of times, on shows and stuff. Yeah, so it's not the real thing, between you and God, if you believe in God, or between you and the angels, or whatever it is, if you believe in the angels. Did you want to say something about that?
Well, when the first person spoke, I was thinking about the slur itself, which I consider a form of hate speech.
Yes.
And that's where you get problematic areas, if hate speech is protected by the First Amendment or not, and I would argue it's not. But ethnic humor isn't necessarily an expression of hate, but it still can be an expression of racism in terms of how it represents different groups. So perhaps because it doesn't have that kind of anger behind it, like in Dog's statements, it comes to be accepted here, particularly Hawaii, in the way that certain groups are being demeaned in the same way that they might be if the terms of which are slanderous.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. You know, I mean, I'm Arab American, Palestinian specifically. And there have been a lot of racial slurs and discrimination, institutional and state discrimination against Arab Americans, Muslim Americans. And the recent thing that's happening in LA is that the LAPD is mapping out areas where there are Muslims and Arabs and, you know, those kind of people, you know, whom we have to protect ourselves from, even though they are American, like third generation or whatever, it doesn't matter, you know, citizens and so on. And then the chief of police, I don't know his name now, he was asked and he said, oh, well, we would like to map them out so we can reach out to these kind of groups. You talk about, you know, the combination of anti-Arab speech, anti-Muslim speech, and state practices, state policies. You're talking about even, you know, in terms of, you want in the larger picture, the political economy as a whole, and the class differentiation and so on. Then you would wonder, why is it when somebody attacks Arab Americans in speech or otherwise, or physically, not much happens, you know? But when somebody says, you know, the N-word, something big happens. So to what would you attribute this? And both of them are hate speeches and, you know, hate practices. Yeah. Anyone? This is a, you know. I mean,
Well, we were talking about this today in one of my classes about how a lot of, still today, racial discussions and discussions of ethnicity as well are often presented in the context of race and about this black-white binary. And anything else is kind of external to the discourse on race in the U.S. I mean, we know that's problematic because then we lose the discussion of a multitude of other individuals who are still experiencing the impact of, shall we say, levels of racism and different types of racism in the society. But I think also, Ibrahim, you were talking about this issue of being criminalized as well. And that's very important to think about because even as we talk about dog and so forth, we're missing something even with him. He makes a living. He makes a living off of the criminalization of people of color on this island, you know, and in these islands. Okay, individuals who are mostly, in many cases, working class and poor people of color. Okay, local people, and that's what he does for a living. So that's the larger issue. They become part of a great institution called the prison industrial complex because of the work he does. So whether he says the N-word is kind of beside the point.
Yeah, actually, this is the more problematical, for him. You know, I want to. We talked about Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and all these things that are happening to them these days, thanks to the war on terror. You know, but the other thing
How's
is,
that going?
Yeah, the war on terror. You gotta ask Bush; he will tell you.
Maybe he'll call tonight.
Hey, let me. Yeah, he has nothing else to do, right?
Tap your phone. Okay.
Yeah, but I want to connect it to the Gina 6 in Louisiana. I mean, that is also, you know, hate speech. I mean, to me, like a noose hanging from a tree is hate speech and, you know, bordering on action. Well, it is action as well. And speech is action, in fact, yeah. And then the practices of the justice system or injustice system, whichever, if you will, in Louisiana, Gina, Louisiana. And then the whole hullabaloo that it created, I mean, rightly so, to say, hey, this is 2007 USA, and everybody says we are all, you know, in the words of Bush, we are all one nation out of many people and all that kind of stuff, and this whole assimilation thing, you know. So what do you think about that? And is it correct for me to connect like the Arab American or what's happening to Arab Americans with the Gina 6, for instance? Anyone? Pensri?
Well, the thing is with the noose, it has as I kind of got up, it has a different implication than a racial slur, because racial slur can be an outburst. A noose has a directly different implication. It's about threat of violence, threat of homicide in particular. And so in that sense, it's much more egregious. And the fact
But they didn't mean anything with it. we are told by one of the upstanding citizens.
True. And just because they said that doesn't mean that they don't understand what is the cultural context. Because when do we learn about the noose? It's usually in a class context or in a film where there is threat of violence. And so just because the person says there is no symbolic significance means that they're lying.
Yes.
Because how did
absolutely.
they get the impression of using the noose as opposed to any other marker?
And what does that say about the educational system and the system of socialization in general? You know, I mean, from the family to school to, you know, all kinds of stuff. You know, other institutions like the police and what the police does. You know, if you're black or you know, Muslim with a or a Sikh, you know, with this headdress, walking in a white neighborhood, would the police stop you, say in LA or San Fran or something? I bet they would, you know. Anyway, so I can give you stories about that they did to these to some people. But anyway, would you like to comment on this? Or some other thing?
You know, hanging the noose isn't necessarily a crime, yeah?
Yeah.
And this is where we can distinguish between hate crimes and acts of, say, anti-black violence. So the threat through the hanging of the noose, one would say it's an act of anti-black violence, so? But it's not a crime. And this is the reason why, particularly in Asian American studies, we make a distinction between hate crimes and anti-Asian violence, because anti-Asian violence is a much broader term. These acts of violence can be committed by the police, for example, or these acts may not be considered crimes. And from using a term like that, you're able to capture the extent of abuse, harassment, or even violence against communities that may not be considered crimes, especially by the police, who aren't willing to indict themselves for brutality against members of a community.
So here it's important, the distinction, you know, between violence and crime, because then the way it is defined legally, the police cannot commit crime because in the you know, carrying out their duty unless he used excessive force, not sanctioned by the rules that you know, the police usually follows, and so forth and so on. But to me, I mean, the larger thing is if it is a hate crime or crime. I mean, well, to me, it's a crime by the police. You know, in this case, even though technically it's not. It is a product of racism and product of socialization in terms of how you think about others and how you relate to others. So that is critical, I think. You know.
Well, if I can add something about this issue of the Gina 6, even though we can't technically consider it a hate crime, or we don't necessarily have a legal articulation of the hate act to that extent, as Pensri notes, the historical context of the noose is very clear. Sure. There was no other object placed there. You know, a squishy little doll with a smile on its face was not placed under that tree by any means. But of course, the key here is that it did lead to the engagement of 6 African American youths with the criminal justice system on a level that was quite commensurate with what would have gone on during the period where the noose was at its heightened point, called the lynching period during Jim Crow. So it's very interesting, but the problem is, and you mentioned family, how do we deal with this? Are they socialized in a particular way? Are they learning it in school? You know, students learning that the noose has some type of significance and they can use it to offend. If anything, in the case of family, the one youth, the young man who was white, who was beaten up and led to this situation, and it was questionable, you know, to what extent he was beaten up and so forth. But that aside, he was approached by white supremacist organizations, and his family commented, "Well, we were, you know, shocked that even the white supremacists would be interested in him, and we didn't raise him that way." And of course, the whole town of Gina kept saying, "Well, that's not us. We're not like this." Yes. But you are like this. Yes, this happened here, and either something is not being discussed, or something is being discussed. And I would say, if anything, in the 21st century, it tends to be more of the former, that something is not being discussed in the family, to the extent that opinions are being formed based on what? I mean, is it, do we blame the media? Do we blame, you know, too many bad films? Or something has said to these students that were part of this white community that sat under the tree and hung a noose, that it was okay to to exclude African Americans rather from their community.
The interesting thing is that the black students didn't go and sit under the tree. They had to go and ask the principal or the vice principal, whatever, is it okay for us to? That shouldn't have been asked. They should have just gone and sat under a tree if the the situation in the school did not allow for that separation. And where was the principal in the beginning to see that there is separation and just put a stop to it? Okay, what happens there? But a larger issue, it seems to me, it is, as you were talking, I'm asking myself, what is the connection really, or the relationship between the students who did, put the noose, hang the noose from the tree, and the justice system, and Gina at least? Is there a relationship between the socialization of the community on the one hand, and the creation of such a justice system that hands like what, 100-year sentence to to these young black youth? I mean, so there must be something here, and we're talking about it directly, indirectly, but maybe it is important to talk a little bit more about this. Pensri, any ideas on that?
I'm not familiar with what was going on in that community at the time that allowed for this type of institutional injustice in its justice system. So I don't feel comfortable speaking on this issue. But
okay, so I just wanted, you were following this, John?
Well, maybe the young people take their lead from what they see the adults doing. So that's why they hung the news, because they knew this was a way of expressing a threat to African Americans in the community. And now that they see that the justice system supports them, they may feel that they can get away with this again. In the same way that with Doug Chapman and Larry Price, apologies seem to be sufficient, or Don Imus, when there aren't any major sanctions. And so others feel that they can also engage in the same kind of behavior.
Yeah, I mean,
I was just thinking, I mean, we talk about disconnects all the time, and I think there's a disconnect there. But even as we sit in Hawaii, I think we need to actually think about what happens here a bit more. I mean, there was a high school event here in 2005 at Radford High, where there was, a conflict, a racialized fight, we can say. It was about, bigotry, the N-word, and so forth, right here in Hawaii. A lot of it splits in the discussion of the local, non-local binary that we have here in Hawaii, but also quite explicitly there was racial discourse against blacks, and the N-word was uttered and so forth. And there was the response, if you remember back a couple of years, was from Radford High, seemed to at first be slightly tepid and kind of understanding that initially they had a problem, and then of course attacking that problem or thinking about it came from pressure from the outside, parents, NAACP, individuals who were really concerned that this was happening in Hawaii. But even subsequent discussions about it and interviewing students, I can remember former students at Radford High said, oh yes, African American students that said, oh yes, we had this experience too, if I remember paraphrasing one situation, someone said, well, a friend of mine was called the N-word, and we were basically told, well, the person who called you that doesn't really understand what it means. So you better get used to it here, in essence. And this is from the administration. And so in this kind of, so in our fantasy of the multicultural paradise, we have some very potentially violent circumstances here because people are supposedly ignorant. But I would posit that it's not necessarily ignorance, it's just inattention. And we need to look at this.
Yeah, it's interesting, like I've been noticing over the years that anything like this happens, whoever is supposed to be responsible begins to circle the wagons, rather than like meet it head on, and even like nip it in the, not only nip it in the bud, even like anticipate that things like that might be happening and figure out what to do about it. Just like with the Gina 6, why should the black students go and ask the principal or the vice principal, can we sit under the tree? Oh yeah, you can sit, it's campus, open campus. But they should have seen what was going on, at the time, the administration, and so on. So it is really a matter of, things that we have to pay more attention to, especially like the people who are in a position of responsibility in the educational system or otherwise, in the police department for that matter, and so on. Did you want to say
Well,
something?
when Elisa brought up that incident in Radford, there was also an incident on campus here where the son of the basketball coach, who had a paid position with the basketball team, I don't know if he was team manager or something, he used the N-word in a confrontation with an African-American fan right here on campus. And I forget what the sanction was, but I mean, he was a state employee, university employee, the son of the basketball coach. Majority of players are African-American, and he got away with it to some extent by using that term. So the issue is that we've had a history in Hawaii, a very recent history also, of the use of the N-word against African members of our community. And so this Dog Chapman incident is hardly new.
Right.
But if people shouldn't seem surprised that this has happened. And I'm sure if you talk to other people in the African American community, they can tell you of other personal incidents in which they've been called by that term. I've had students say that that happened to them going to public high schools here in Hawaii. You know, when they first show up on campus as a freshman, and then somebody, one of the upper class students, comes up to them and says, "Hello, my N-word," like that. That's a greeting to him as a new student on campus. So I think we should see this as not an isolated incident.
No,
it's
not at all. I remember
something
from
that's
the
ongoing
70s,
in
yeah.
Hawaii. Sure.
The 70s here, even like when some African Americans would go to a nightclub, they're not admitted. You know why? Because they are blacks. That's why. And they're not admitted by whom? The interesting thing, by Samoans, you know, who are on the at the door, you know, and stuff like that. So that's interesting thing about ethnic relations here. And we brought up the topic of like and we had the topic before on this show about the ethnic rainbow in Hawaii, and you alluded to it just now. And I think, you know, not everything is hunky-dory in Hawaii. I mean, that is, again, something that need to be stated and restated, and to try and figure out what is it that we can do, not only as educators, but people who are, you know, in public policy positions, etc., not to allow this to happen, and figure out ways, whether it's in the educational system, etc., from KG on, and even before that, because there are things before that, right? To try to figure out how we can best serve the community and get rid of all this hate speech, discrimination, institutional racism, racism in general, you know, and then see the relationship between that institutional racism and that kind of speech that in some quarters is tolerated, and if it's not tolerated, you can, you know, say, I'm sorry, and, you know, mea culpa, and I go back to my own show. I mean, I was shocked when, in a sense, like Imus in the morning, like is off the air, you know, and Doug Chapman's off the air, but Larry Price kept going, you know. I mean, what's happening here?
Well, let's think about sponsorship again. It's the corporate issue.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
look at, you've got this, what is it, Yums Inc. that has all of these franchises that work with that support the Chapman show, which includes, you know, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and KFC, you know, and they say, we don't want to lose our African-American fast food patrons. And, you know, I'd be glad if they did, actually, because, you know, I'm concerned about health issues and other things, vegetarian that I am, and I'll just plug that in there. But the other side of it is that they're doing it, they're saying, well, we don't need him around because he's used the N-word and it's bad for business. But obviously with the whole Price show, there's something else. I don't know who their sponsors are, but clearly they didn't have a problem. And in the context of Hawaii, again, this ability to get away with ethnic slurs as something that's not really meant, or not really, you know, painful, or it's slightly innocuous. We just do that to all get along. Obviously, that doesn't work because we have very serious hierarchies here that show that we all don't get along.
Absolutely.
So what do we do about that becomes the first question.
Well, the interesting thing, like, you know, the senator was Gary Hooser with Larry Price, and then I don't know what the Senate did. Did they, like, condemn it? Did you hear anything? No. Well, what did they do? They left him hanging, you know, to dry, in a sense, you know, like all by himself. And then a few, I'm not sure if it's in the news or in the media only. I read in the media about, you know, Larry Price said blah, 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 etc. And then I'm sorry, and then that's it. Well, what happened?
Well, and it was kind of an odd "I'm sorry."
Yeah.
I mean, his
Yeah,
partner
yeah.
said, "Oh,
That's
you
right.
shouldn't have apologized." He apologizes,
immediately.
and immediately in the same broadcast, a sentence later,
Yeah.
he's saying, you know, in essence, I don't know why you're apologizing.
Yeah. Because the other guy is Howley,
yeah.
presumably. You know.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, this is the question. This, you know, Hoosier was attacked,
Yeah.
in essence,
That's
saying,
right.
"Why do you have blue eyes? Where are you from?"
Yeah, yeah.
And so you don't belong, quite clearly. And
Yeah.
why that mattered in the
Yes.
context of his political argument is the key issue. I mean, you might not agree with what he does politically.
Yes,
You might now think, ooh, the super ferry issue, I don't like what he's doing with that, or either way. But it's not because he has blue eyes that
yeah.
that should not be the reason.
Yeah,
You
right,
know, but
right.
clearly that was acceptable, and acceptable enough for there not to be a long outrage after that. Apologize, you shouldn't apologize. Oh, well, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Next show.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, really troubling in the sense. So, any other things on this particular thing before we move on to other issues?
I think one of the main problems, and of course I'm recent transplant to the islands, so I'm still observing and trying to understand the dynamic here in Hawaii. But at least from students and from my discussions with students in our classes, I think the real problem is that they feel that you can't have a critical discussion about multiculturalism or inter-ethnic or interracial relationships if there's going to be something bad said. And they don't understand that it's okay to be critical. And by being critical, you're not necessarily insulting, but you're trying to learn. And if they know that there is a safe space to discuss their opinions and their lack of knowledge about what's going on, then they're more willing to understand, to be critical of their own stereotypes, and then challenge each other. But the problem is, they're afraid. At least the students seem to be afraid. They don't want to say anything bad. They want to be PC. And I'm wondering if that's part of the reason, and again, I'm still new to the islands, is that that's part of the reason for why there is no discussion. It's not that there is acceptance, it's just that there's a silence because no one wants to say anything.
Yeah, John, you might want to comment on this.
Well, I think I agree with Pensri. I guess that's just kind of pretending that we all get along by saying politically correct things in class, or just not expressing one's true feelings, the kind of perhaps resentment that people might have.
But I mean, how do you work against that? I mean, we can do that in our classes, right? Because in a way, students are required to talk critically about these issues. We are teaching courses on ethnic studies, and in a way, the students who show up in our classes and stay enrolled in our classes are more willing to have those type of discussions. But then what happens to those who are not pre-selected that way? I mean, how do we encourage it? Which goes back to the question that you had posed earlier, and I don't know how to do that. Because you need to have people who are willing to speak their mind and not be PC in a society here in Hawaii where it's supposed to be about being aloha and being this rainbow society that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, I think from my observation is that if say I am Howley and been here like for a couple of years, etc. And I hear somebody like a Howley lawyer attacking Bishop Estate or Hawaiian rights, etc. Well, he's Howley. I don't want to say things, whatever they may be, even if I don't agree with him, that lawyer. I don't want to say things even like somewhat critical, or for me to raise a question to better understand what's going on here, because people might mistake me for having the same kind of ideas as that guy, or ideas similar to that, even though I'm willing to learn. So I think what I say to students, I mean, not directly, but indirectly, is that this is a safe space, I don't have the corner on the truth, but anything you say won't be held against you in a court of law or otherwise. But anything you say is good so long you back it up. I mean, I say I don't like this idea about, your opinion counts just like yours and mine, etc. No, all opinions are not equal, unless they are, backed up by documentation, by archival material, by, documentation, references, etc. Otherwise, you gotta learn how to do those things before you can say something. But the main thing is that you have to have free and safe space or zone for learning. I mean, this is critical to me. And I begin to criticize certain things, then the students are encouraged to criticize, along those lines, because they say, well, he's doing it, what I'm saying, and I encourage them to do it, And I know, and we have a number of incidents in Hawaii that happened where, some professor would go attacking students for saying something against a particular group or whatever it is. These things happen. John has seen these things happen as well. So that's not good, it seems to me. It's just a matter of make sure that people understand this is a safe zone for learning, and criticizing and, saying whatever it is that you want to say. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask Elisa if she's brought up this issue in her class, in her African American experience class. And
well, also a race
reaction
class
for
in the
students.
law. I think both classes. I asked students what they felt about this, and all of them were saying they were not particularly surprised about the dog issue at all. And there's some things that were said that I probably can't say, but one student who was actually racialized as white said, "Oh, this is no surprise. He's blank trash," we'll just put it that way. And so, something related to a trailer and other situations. So, the point is that I'm making is that it's, it leads to other discussions about, class and those relationships. But I brought it up in different contexts. But certainly when we talk about race in any way, and going on what Pensri was saying, here there is always a silence in some places. But I find in my classes, for the most part, we get a good chunk of students who are eventually able to speak out and talk about what's going on. But it's not always easy, and I understand that Hawaii is often a space where individuals don't necessarily want to have a conflict on many levels, and that's the larger issue. It's not just around racial slurs. It's about speaking out, and I think the space of the island often requires a lot of compromise that, if anything, inhibits and prohibits real substantive discussion about race, ethnicity, and other conflicts, which is a problem.
I was not exactly struck, but I say, oh, when I heard that to the question, should the Chapman, the dog show, be canceled or not? And although it wasn't like a statistical kind of study or a poll or whatever, just call in. You might call in 3 times. It doesn't matter. But the fact of the matter is that overwhelming majority, no, it shouldn't. So what does that tell you?
No, I wasn't surprised at that. I was surprised. One result I saw was 55-45. I was surprised it wasn't much higher because he is a popular figure. So I figured that he would get a much higher extension of support, but not at all. I didn't think at all people would be opposed to.
I wasn't surprised either. But I'm saying, what does that tell us? When this result, if it is a result, really. I mean, so it's...
They don't see it as a significant issue. Big deal.
Absolutely.
So
My point in the sense that, we have failed as a society to educate and, socialize in the proper way.
Because one can point to other examples of public officials who had to resign their positions for making private remarks. Like Reagan's former agricultural secretary made a joke that a reporter overheard and then mentioned, and then he had to resign.
In fact, Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee was going after one congressperson because, he did kind of attack Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, by saying something derogatory, etc. So it is happening in that thing.
It's a position of power.
Absolutely.
Again, and that's the key. It goes back to what Pensri is saying. Those are, and we're all discussing this idea. If you have power.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you for watching, and thank you for coming to discuss this issue. Thank you. Yeah.